Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this presentation is on World War II, Part 1. So the lead up, the first few years of the war, and really the rise of Nazi power in Europe. As we begin to move closer and closer to the beginning of the Second World War, and ultimately Hitler's attempt to fulfill his vision of blitzkrieging all of Western and Eastern Europe and creating a racial Aryan Germanic empire, which was really his goal with the Second World War. As we move closer and closer to it, you start to see a more formulaic persecution of Jewish individuals in Germany. This picture is a depiction from the Night of Broken Glass in 1938, in which the Nazis underwent a formulaic destruction and vandalizing of Jewish property. Jewish individuals were increasingly cordoned off into urban ghettos. They were being isolated and targeted with the concentration camps and, of course, eventually with the death camps. By 1941, the Nazis will require that Jewish people wear the Star of David with the word Jude written on it, and increasingly Jewish people will begin to be shipped to concentration camps. And after the so-called final solution was ordered in 1942, you begin to see death camps in which Jewish people are increasingly being shipped to be exterminated. Jewish individuals were deemed by Hitler to be what were called the Untermenschen, which were so-called subhumans. They were deemed to be a lesser race, along with Slavs and Gypsies and Poles and so forth. And these people were targeted with ultimately enslavement and persecution and ultimately extermination as part of Hitler's goal to create an expansive Aryan or Nordic people's empire in Europe. And so this is when we really start to see the development of the Holocaust really begin in earnest. Throughout the diplomacy of the late 1930s and lead up to World War II, Hitler really displayed the same kind of savvy as a diplomat as he had as a leader coming to power in Germany. So as Hitler came to power in Germany, he took absolute power by putting on the kind of image that his movement to power was done legally. So he uses the guise of legality as he comes to absolute authority in Germany, and he uses the image of legality in his rise to power. In his diplomacy with the French and the Czechs and the British and the Poles and these other countries throughout Europe and Austria. When Hitler will in 1938, he will annex Austria. Hitler in 1936 occupied the Rhineland. He pulled Germany out of the League of Nations and ultimately told everyone that he was rearming. He did things like he negotiated a naval treaty with Great Britain in which the British agreed to allow Hitler to have a navy that was 35% the size of the British Navy. And the British considered it a success, but in reality it was a savvy victory for Hitler, because Hitler had effectively gotten the British to agree that Hitler had a right to rearm. So Hitler uses the claim of legality. When it came to Czechoslovakia, Hitler very much uses the claim of self-determination, that the Sudetenland Czechs were German and they should be allowed to join with Germany. And so when he placed the claim on Czechoslovakia that ultimately becomes associated with the Munich Conference, he largely uses the demand of self-determination for the Sudetenland Czechs in that claim, and so he's consistently using the kind of guise of legality to expand his power. And all along in this process, Hitler's really gambling. He's gambling that the Allies don't have stomach to stand up for him against him militarily, and of course he's right about that at this time. The Allies had been decimated from World War I, and they desperately wanted to avoid another war. And so Hitler's able to use that position of appeasement and really a position of weakness for the Allies to expand his power in Central Europe as he prepared for the beginning of the war. And of course, Hitler was eyeing Russia. We'll talk about this in a later slide, but Hitler was eyeing Russia. He sought to invade Russia to create for the German people Lebensraum. And he would do this largely by enslaving or killing the Untermenschen, who are the subhumans that they deemed occupied areas of Eastern Europe: Jews, Slavs, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, and so forth. This is his plan all along. Even though this is his plan all along that was written about in Mein Kampf, Hitler's able to negotiate the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact with Stalin, in which Stalin agrees to a treaty in which the Soviets and the Nazis will divide up Germany. So again, Hitler's able to make his intentions less well known. He's able to use legality and treaties to allow him to expand his power. And of course, the war begins in 1939 in September, when the Nazis blitzkrieg into Poland. And Poland will fall in about 4 weeks' time. The German military strategy is known as Blitzkrieg, and Blitzkrieg basically means lightning war. And effectively what this refers to is the usage of mechanized and heavily armored panzer divisions combined with heavy assaults from the German Air Force or the Luftwaffe to attack an enemy's lines with very swift and direct attack on a very focused point. Attack with speed, with overwhelming force on a very focused area of the enemy's lines, and then break through into the enemy's interior and envelop them in what are called large pincer maneuvers, seizing huge amounts of territories and seizing capitals and strategic areas more quickly than the enemy can adapt with. And of course, in 1939, Poland falls to the German Blitzkrieg. Hitler will then turn onto Denmark, which effectively surrenders almost immediately. In the first usage of paratroopers in a major offensive ever in history of warfare, Hitler attacks and conquers Norway just before the British can get involved. Now, after this had occurred, Hitler was immediately intent on turning and going towards France in the winter of 1939 and 1940. And there was a great deal of resistance to this from his high command. And it really is a testament to the fact that throughout the war, Hitler often disagreed with his high command, and his high command often disagreed with him. The high command oftentimes thought many of the decisions that Hitler was making, militarily speaking, were highly risky and, threatened to immerse Germany into a massive total war of attrition that could decimate the country. His attempt to fight in France in the wintertime led to some of the original plots to assassinate Hitler. So there was not unity and support with Hitler. Much of the leadership of the armed forces were very concerned by actions of Hitler from very early on, and there will be numerous attempts to overthrow and assassinate Hitler for this reason. Of course, the plan was delayed anyway. The weather delayed the plan, and instead the invasion of France begins in May of 1940, and it lasts about 6 weeks. The Germans attack France through an area of the Ardennes forest around Luxembourg and southern Belgium. And this was an area that the French thought was not a place where you could possibly take a modern military through in a major assault. It's densely forested, it's very rough terrain, and they thought that it was just simply not somewhere that you could invade from. And for this reason, they had really not extended their defensive kind of fortification known as the Maginot Line up to the Ardennes Forest. So it was a sort of open area. The Maginot Line was a huge defensive fortification that was built on the border with Germany after World War I. And in a lot of respects was a testament to the fact that the French preferred to remain in a defensive posture rather than taking on the Germans. And after the Germans had attacked Poland, this period becomes known as the so-called Phony War, in which the British and the French declare war on Germany but do nothing. And Germany was relatively unprepared to deal with an attack on its western front, but the Allies just do not have the mobilization or the will to take the initiative and begin the war at that time. By the spring of 1940, as there's a war, but seemingly the Allies are trying to avoid it, the Germans will attack France, and they will attack through the Ardennes forests, catching the French and the Allies by surprise. The Battle of France lasts about 6 weeks, and France will fall, but the British and parts of the French army escape out of the port of Dunkirk in one of the most important evacuations of the war. It saved the British army and allowed the British to, yes, flee back to Great Britain, but to fight another day. And that was highly significant. And I'm going to talk about the Battle of Britain on the next slide. You saw yet another example of Hitler sort of having disagreements and oftentimes vetoing his high command with Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa, which began on June 22nd, 1941, was an operation that really much of Hitler's high command suggested should have been delayed for a year because of the size and scale of the operation. It was a late start. They had hoped originally to start it in the early spring, but there was there's a late winter thaw. The streams and rivers remained very high, and the soil was very muddy, and so they couldn't launch the invasion earlier. There's also the problem with the conflict erupting in North Africa and British involvement in the areas around Greece after the Italian attack there that also took the attention of the Germans for a little while. However, Hitler demands the invasion of Russia will occur, and Hitler was rather overconfident. And this was largely because Hitler's whole plan, as he laid out in Mein Kampf, was to attack Eastern Europe and to create a large central German continental empire that would create so-called Lebensraum, or living space, for the Aryan Nordic peoples, as they would have described them. Hitler believed that in this process, the people that were of Nordic descent would ultimately join the German Empire and would become part of this new continental empire, this racial empire, and that the Slavs, the Jews, the Poles, the Russians, Ukrainians, and so forth would effectively be either exterminated or they would have their land seized and they would be effectively enslaved in servitude for this German racial empire. That was his original plan the entire time. And so on June 22nd, 1941, he catches Stalin by surprise and violates the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, launching an invasion into Russia. And again, there was disagreement over the high command. The high command in Germany thought that the German army should go straight for Moscow to seize the capital and seize the leadership effectively, and they thought that would end the war quickly. Hitler wanted to focus on the economic areas, and so the attack is a large three-front attack focusing on areas like St. Petersburg, Kiev, and in 1942 they will go down towards the Caucasus Mountains, which results, of course, in the Battle of Stalingrad. Of course, the invasion of Russia was a big mistake, and Hitler, because he saw the region in this sort of racial lens, the people that occupied this area of the world were described as the Untermenschen, which were subhumans. They were not, as in the eyes of the Nazis, they were not superior humans, and so they wouldn't be able to put up the kind of resistance that Hitler expected. And by the way, Hitler had never envisioned the British as opponents. Hitler saw the British as a natural ally, and he had gambled that the British would negotiate with him and accept a German continental empire, and the British would accept a global empire and a navy on the high seas. Hitler was rather shocked when the British will resist and side with the French and really form the basis for the Allied resistance. This caught Hitler by surprise. And Hitler in no way, Hitler will fail to conquer Britain, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. But he really didn't expect to fight Great Britain. He expected to first conquer Poland, then Denmark, Norway, and of course Western Europe. And then his designs were to go into Eastern Europe and to blitz all the way into Russia and win a huge success in the Eastern Front very quickly. And he thought he could do this largely because of the fact that the Russian leadership, military leadership, was deemed to be weak, but largely because he deemed the people in his path as subhumans, and so he did not really respect their ability to resist in the way that they did. And of course, it would be a great mistake. Eventually, Hitler accepts the goal of Moscow as a primary goal in the operation, and the Nazis Germany got within miles of Moscow, but of course they fall just short, and they become trapped in the Russian winter, a winter they hadn't prepared for. The Luftwaffe's range was not long enough to fly fully into the front. The front lines for the Germans were so spread out and so long, it was a logistical nightmare. The Russian trains had different gauge tracks, so you couldn't effectively. It was very difficult to effectively supply your troops. Your soldiers went on these huge front, and they don't go in fully prepared for the Russian winter, largely because Hitler doesn't assume that that's going to be an issue in terms of time frame. Furthermore, the Nazi army was not fully mechanized going in here either, and so there was parts of the columns that went in that were not fully mechanized with tracked vehicles and so forth. And so as a result of that, there was a lot of difficulty with one part of the line outrunning the other part of the line. So it was really a logistic nightmare. And it's here where the war will really bog down for the Nazis and where the Nazi defeat will eventually begin. Now, go back to the aftermath of the invasion of France. After Hitler had conquered France, and after the British had barely escaped at Dunkirk, Hitler would prepare for an invasion of England. And this invasion plan was known as Operation Sea Lion, which had planned an attack across the English Channel. Blitzkrieg was not going to work with Great Britain because of the English Channel. And in a lot of respects, this was a gamble where Hitler had really misjudged the situation. Hitler had very much envisioned the British being willing to tolerate a Nazi German empire, that he really envisioned the British as being willing to bargain with the Nazis to allow Germany to consolidate its continental empire if Germany allowed the British to maintain its global empire and its massive navy. Of course, this was not the case. After the defeat of France, Winston Churchill, who is made prime minister after Neville Chamberlain, Winston Churchill becomes the leader who really inspires the British to resist the Germans. And of course, this begins with the so-called Battle of Britain, which began in 1940, and really, I think, can be said continued throughout the war. It went through a number of different phases, but initially the Battle of Britain involved a German Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe was the German Air Force, and it was led by Airman Göring. And Göring's Luftwaffe was actually poorly equipped to strategically defeat Great Britain. The Nazis planned to effectively eliminate ineffective defense for the British, and that would mean by gaining superiority of the air and eliminating much of the radar installations of the British. If the Germans could gain air superiority and limit much of the radar capabilities, then the Operation Sea Lion could begin. Well, some of the problems, and this again speaks to the somewhat hasty and overconfident perspective of the Germans going into the war, the Germans very much had a great deal of overconfidence, and in a lot of respects, during the Battle of Britain, the British had a lot of reasons to not be overconfident. The Luftwaffe was it outnumbered the British RAF. The Me-109s, the Messerschmitts that the German fighter pilots flew, had a much higher caliber cannon compared to the Spitfires, which you see pictured here. The British Spitfires, which were very mobile and very fast and excellent fighter plane. It's one of the best planes of the war, but initially they had very small guns, and they were it was very hard to shoot down these Me-109s, which had bigger guns. And so the RAF saw themselves, and the British saw themselves in the most desperate of desperate situation. They were the ultimate underdog in this. In a lot of respects, the Germans were overconfident. They overestimated how much destruction they were exacting on the RAF. And as a result of that, they tended to misjudge the degree to which the British Air Force's capability had been worn down. The British have radar stations all around their island, and this is one of the great technological advantages of the British, was the use of radar, new technology. The Luftwaffe's bombers and their fighter planes had limited range. The Luftwaffe, an Me-109 fighter plane could actually only fly over London for about 9 minutes. And if they lasted long, if they were over the target longer, they would run out of fuel and crash into the channel before they would arrive back at their bases. And so there was limited range of German bombers. They couldn't target the entirety of England. They really could only effectively target the southeastern corner of Great Britain. And in a lot of respects, too, there must be a lot of credit given to the heroism of the British RAF, the Royal Air Force, and the Spitfires that they flew, as well as the passionate and inspiring leadership of Winston Churchill, who stays in London throughout the Blitz and it helps to inspire the resistance of the British. As the Blitz, as it's called, the Battle of Britain, as it carries out, the Germans never get Britain to a point in which get Great Britain to a point in which they're ready to unleash Operation Sea Lion. Instead, what happens is the British were able to retaliate and bomb in Germany, and this so incensed Hitler that Hitler desired to bomb London as a form of punishment. And Hitler basically ends the strategic bombing of England and focuses instead on an attempt to try to terrorize the population of London and break their will. Hitler increasingly gives up on the plan to actually defeat and conquer the British, and instead rather eagerly will turn and face towards Russia with his grand goal of Lebensraum, of a conquest of Russia. And so the Battle of Britain really continues throughout the war, and in the latter phases of the war you will see Britain bombarded with V-2 ballistic missiles as well as V-1 missiles, which were sort of look like flying bombs, if you will. And London continued to be terrorized throughout the war. But the RAF, the inspiration of Churchill, and also limitations and overconfidence on the part of the Germans really prevented any attempted invasion of Great Britain and allowed the British to win the Battle of Britain in what is absolutely the most desperate moment of the conflict for the Allies. So the goal of Hitler and the Nazis and the SS as the real driving force of the Nazi ideological movement was really for Lebensraum. And Lebensraum means living space. Now, originally this concept, like many items, predated the Nazis. This was a concept that geopolitical theorists had developed in the early 20th century, and it suggested that nation-states had a right to guarantee their people resources and agricultural land and so forth, living space. But This was changed by the Nazis. It was first Rudolf Hess who heard this concept, and Rudolf Hess introduced Hitler to the concept and in the 1920s, and of course this became a central piece of Hitler's plan. And the Nazis change it by really racializing it, by redefining Lebensraum to mean effectively creating a large continental empire for Nordic or Aryan peoples. So Lebensraum for the Nazis meant effectively the enslavement of the so-called Untermenschen of Eastern Europe. The Untermenschen were believed to be subhumans, and these were Slavs, Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, Russians, and so forth, that the ideology, the racial ideology of the Nazis insisted were subhumans. And, of course, this encouraged arrogance on the part of Hitler when it came to military affairs, and it also leads to the death of millions and millions of people. Lebensraum for the Nazis meant effectively that as the Nazis spread out into Eastern Europe and created this huge sort of Aryan empire, that other Nordic peoples would join in and they would partake in this living space. But the believed to be subhumans would be enslaved or killed. Their land would be seized. They would be forced to go to work camps, and they would either be eliminated or they would serve effectively as servants of the Aryan Nordic Empire. So the Nazis racialized the concept of Lebensraum, and instead for them, Lebensraum means the creation of a massive racial German empire in Europe. And this motivates the development of the Holocaust, in which in 1942 Hitler gives the order of the final solution. And of course you see depicted here Nazi soldiers with executed civilians, and of course you see these types of images play out all over Europe. Groups like the SS Einsatzgruppen, the death squads, used to go out and patrol the sort of the areas in the rears, and they would find in places like Poland, for example, they would find intellectuals, Jewish people, and so forth, and oftentimes would simply execute them. Millions of people were killed in these types of activities. Eventually, of course, the so-called Untermenschen were the Jews, the Slavs, the Gypsies, Russians, Poles, and so forth, were sent to concentration camps that ultimately, after 1942, become death camps. And this is after the enacting of the so-called final solution, as Zyklon B is used to gas millions of people and to incinerate their bodies on massive scales, and if not that, to bury them in mass graves. Of course, the SS, here you see depicted Heinrich Himmler at a concentration camp. Of course, the concentration camps went back to the early 1930s, and they don't truly become death camps until after the final solution of 1942. That's not to say that people were not worked to death intentionally in them, but after the so-called final solution, which was a term that was meant to refer to the decision to exterminate the Jews and the other so-called subhuman races that were in the way of the Nazis, the final solution really led to a formulaic development of the Nazi death camps. The SS was led by Heinrich Himmler, as we mentioned in a previous presentation, and of course the SS oversaw the concentration camps. They were responsible for rounding up Jews, Poles, Slavs, and so forth for the concentration camps or their execution. In the SS training, there was oftentimes the usage of amphetamines to encourage brutality when coupled with the very extreme sort of training that the SS were put through. The SS were trained to be the ideological arm, military arm, and police arm of Nazism, and so they were trained to be incredibly brutal and inhumane, and to respond to in order to be brutal and inhumane without thinking. And amphetamines were used as part of their training procedure. So it's really this concept of Lebensraum that really sets up the development, ultimately, of the Holocaust. The last slide I want to talk about is an important lesson about this war in respect. The Germans under Hitler were extremely arrogant about what he was doing, extremely overconfident about how they were approaching this. And so if we contrast what happens in Germany with what happens in the United States in terms of the home front, you really learn something about what the Nazis, what Hitler planned and expected in the war. Hitler by no means underestimated the United States, but Hitler was never preparing himself for a long-term total war. Hitler thought that his strategy of Blitzkrieg would win the war very quickly. And so as a result of that, whereas the United States, when the United States becomes involved in the war after Pearl Harbor, when, of course, the United States declared war on Japan on December 7th, 1941, and Hitler declares war on the United States on December the 11th, the United States began a complete and full-scale mobilization in which millions were drafted into the army, women went into factories, a full and complete mobilization on the home front. By contrast, while the Americans prepared to get involved in the war for a total war of attrition for the long haul with full mobilization, the outset of the war, the Nazi Germany really never fully mobilized. They don't fully begin mobilization until 1942. And even then, much of the work in terms of war industries and so forth was being conducted by slaves, concentration camp victims, which was very bad for work. On the home front in Germany, Hitler was trying to uplift the sort of German family. He wanted women at home raising little Aryan kids who would then go and join the Nazi youth. It was this ideological mission. He was never really motivated with the idea at the beginning of the war that the conflict would become a total war. He thought he would be able to win the war early and prevent having to prepare and mobilize for full total war. And so as a result of that, the German home front was never fully mobilized. Well, at least not until 1942. Not until the slow defeat, the first setbacks of the war for Germany, had Hitler begun the full mobilization. And that's why when the Nazis went into Russia, the army that went into Russia was not a fully mechanized army. One of the fronts, there was three major fronts that went to St. Petersburg, Kiev, and then one that went in the middle. And these three fronts were not all fully mechanized. And what that means is that there were aspects of at least one of these fronts, these attacking forces, that had things that were being, not pulled by fully tracked mobile vehicles, but rather had, horses pulling things and so forth. And that was a testament to the fact that the Germans were not, at the time of the war, fully really prepared for the war. And of course, as you read in This Week in Bendersky, you know that the Germans were woefully behind military preparations right up until the beginning of the war. They were mobilizing and rearming, but when the war actually begins, the German army was not really fully mobilized. Or the German home front was not fully mobilized, and the army overall was not fully mechanized, and that really affected the effectiveness of the Russian campaign. And of course, once the war becomes a total war, Germany is really going to be fighting to catch up to try and mobilize the home front and to try to deal with the overwhelming opposition from the United States and from Russia and Britain and so forth. So this was a fundamental problem on the German home front, and this was a fundamental problem with the outlook of Hitler, basically in gambling at the beginning of this war, assuming that it could not and would not be a drawn-out total war, but rather he could use Blitzkrieg and defeat his enemies very quickly. And of course, it was arrogance that led him to underestimate the conflict in the Eastern theater, particularly because of his racial perspective of the people in Eastern Europe. All right, guys, I hope that this is helpful.